Welcome to the North Texas Church of Freethought. It's Sunday, the 14th of January of 2024. It's been a while since we've had presentations, but I hope to do better in 2024. I have lots of ideas that are kind of partially gestating and working their way along, but all of my presentations, at least the ones that I do, take some time in thinking about. Elva has already got a presentation of some kind that she gave elsewhere about Stoicism, and she said that she would share that with us sometime coming up. So we are, as we have said since 1994, the church for the unchurched. We are the home of people who care about religion as one's total reaction upon life, of how we make sense of the subjective, personal, and private experiences of what it is for each of us to be a thinking and feeling being. A freethinker, we say, is, yes, an atheist. We are people who reject the supernatural and other things for which there is insufficient evidence or that require the setting aside of reason. Most of all, we say that a freethinker is a sect of one. Each of us must come to grips with life and its challenges in our own way. Nevertheless, we can learn from each other and share in the excitement and joy of discovering meaning in our lives. So today we're going to consider this question: why is there something instead of nothing? This is not just a generic question where anything might be substituted for the word something. It's not asking why there are some things like stars or oceans or birds or x-rays. It's asking why there is not just anything, but why there is everything that there is, why there is a world of external reality for us to perceive, and indeed why we exist as a part of it. In a way, it's a silly question, for if there were nothing instead of something, we would certainly not be able to ask the question, would we? After all, we are the product of the brute fact that there is something, that this something, a small part of it anyway, in a few locations in the vastness of the universe, has properties that enable it to give rise to living things, that some of these living things have developed complex nervous systems that, as a result of interacting with what is accessible to them, allows the asking of this question or any other question. Yet, some say this is a profound question. Certainly, questioning itself is profound, or it ought to be. It is much more profound than believing, but some go much further with this particular question, saying that it's not just a profound puzzle, but the profound puzzle, glorifying it as the ultimate question. And this is a means, naturally, for this is the real intention, of glorifying the answer that such people propose, of justifying their claim that their answer is something worthy of awe and reverence. Oh, the reckless impudence of those who desperately want to have an answer for everything, a final solution to every puzzle of existence, and an end to questioning itself. That's really what they're after. For, as you may have guessed, the profound answer that some insist goes with the profound question of why there is something rather than nothing is the uncaused cause, the necessary being of God, and you're not allowed to ask, why God? Let's have a closer look at this puzzle. To begin with, as we've often said, it's easy to get bogged down in semantics because what people mean by many, if not most words, can be ambiguous. It can be vague. And as said, something in this case refers not just to anything, but to the aggregate of everything that exists. Usually we call that the universe. But what is the universe? A familiar representation of everything that exists so far as we know. All of space-time and everything within it begins in an unimaginably small point, though it need not have been a so-called singularity, at the Big Bang, and that's over at the left. This is immediately followed from about 10 to the minus 36 to 10 to the minus 32nd seconds, a very tiny amount of time, followed by a period of inflation during which the size of the then universe expanded by a factor of at least 10 to the 78th. That's a 10 with 78 zeros after it. But maybe it expanded a lot more than that. I've not been able to find out if cosmologists have come up with an upper limit on the expansion, but the lower limit is said to be about 10 to the 78th. Even then, we're talking about an expansion from something smaller than a proton to something about a meter across, after which the normal expansion of the universe commenced. So it was a huge increase in size from something smaller than a proton to something about a meter across. But it happened so quickly, and of course that size is still quote-unquote small by our human standards. But now keep in mind that the speed with which such a sudden and enormous expansion of the universe happened over such a short period of time is far greater than the current cosmic speed limit of the velocity of light. What this means is that since the end of the inflationary event, the most distant parts of that meter-sized sphere of reality were no longer in communication with each other because space had expanded faster than light's ability to traverse it. And so today there are regions of what the Big Bang gave rise to that are completely beyond our ability to see, because light from those regions has never reached us, and because of the continued expansion of the universe, and it's a faster and faster expansion of the universe, we now know that light will never reach us. Deepest deep field views of the universe like this that we have today are the furthest we will ever see. In fact, even the furthest objects will no longer be visible to us with the faster and faster expansion of the universe caused by dark energy. Now, every day, the universe expands billions of miles in all directions. But what can we even mean by a term like the universe? Is it just everything that we can see in all directions, that bubble of reality in which we exist that began expanding from the Big Bang a little less than 14 billions of years ago, now 93 billion light years in diameter, and it's so much bigger because of the expansion. And yet, because of cosmological inflation and the continued expansion of the universe, the Big Bang must have given rise to regions of space-time that we cannot see and likely can never know anything about. This picture here suggests that those regions are just beyond our view, but in fact, we may be able to see only a very tiny fraction of what the Big Bang produced. The circle there, the boundary of the observable universe, maybe should be much smaller. So is everything outside that circle also the universe? Surely that is also a part of the something that we may ask why it is instead of there being nothing. We can consider what's out there, but we have to do it in our imagination. And just consider this representation again. From what vantage point can this view be perceived? Strictly speaking, there is no place from which this can be seen. Even to say that it depicts the universe from a point outside of space and time is nonsense. It's a useful way to consider the universe, but we have to do it with our imaginations only, because there's nothing else with which we can do it. So to try to make sense of it is worse than trying to make sense of an M.C. Escher drawing. Of course, there may be places and times that are outside of our own space-time. This is the idea, now popularized by comic books turned into films, of the multiverse, of a constellation of universes disconnected from one another. There may be no way of knowing if such alternate universes exist, or it may be that we haven't yet figured out a way of investigating them. At present, we have only solutions to equations that seem not to apply to the reality that we find ourselves in, but once upon a time, there were solutions to equations that implied what we now call antimatter. First thought to be impossible, and now, of course, we've got bits of antimatter. We can make it. If the multiverse is a real thing, then surely everything that is includes it, as well as perhaps some sub-reality that may be furiously producing alternate universes, or, as comic books speculate, way stations or observation posts between universes. Mind boggles. But the point is that the universe can mean different things. All that exists, as far as we know, is only all that we can perceive, or all that we are aware of, or all that we have very good reason based on sufficient facts to suppose. And always, always, we must qualify all of our ideas, including, and perhaps especially those we are most sure of, because we're less likely to doubt them, with this reservation: it is always so far as we can tell. Remember, this image too, like the other one, depicts what we can only think of in our imaginations. So much for something. Turns out there's quite a lot to say about nothing as well. But unlike something, or all of what we suppose reality and existence are, no one really has any experience of nothing. Nothing is no thing. Like atheism, which is not a belief but the absence of belief, no thing can be mistaken for a thing. And I think the question of why there is something instead of nothing does this. Just try to use the word nothing in a statement and you will see that it does not refer to a thing but to the absence of a thing. If there's nothing in your wallet, there's not anything in your wallet, for example. If you are conscious of nothing, you are unconscious, and so on. Why is there something instead of not anything? That's how we could ask the question. Now, Even so, do we have any experience of not anything? People have been studying this, and it has been an object of science for longer than Big Bang cosmology and speculations about a multiverse, and the story is likewise a complicated and circuitous one. It was known in the 17th century that water could not be pumped higher than 33 feet, or about 10 meters. People fiddled to try to make better pumps, but no matter how much work was put into it, the limitation persisted. The Italian physicist and mathematician Evangelista Torricelli, that guy on the left, he studied with Galileo. You see their lifetimes overlapped. He thought that it might have something to do with the pressure of air. French philosopher, mathematician, and scientist René Descartes, the guy who said, "I think, therefore I am," the guy who was famous for that, he had also suspected it but never investigated further. Well, Torricelli conducted an experiment. He filled a 6-foot-long glass tube open at one end with mercury, a liquid much denser than water. That way he wouldn't have to use a 33-foot-long tube. He then placed the open end of the tube in a bowl of mercury, and what he found is that the mercury fell to 76 centimeters. Torricelli subsequently noted that the level of mercury in the tube varied with atmospheric conditions, rising when the weather was clear and sunny and falling with the approach of storms. He had invented the barometer. He went on to explain that winds are caused by differences in temperature and thus differences in the density of air between different regions on the Earth. The torr unit of pressure is named after Torricelli. A torr is 133 pascals. A pascal is another unit of pressure, which is much more precise, not just 1/760th of an atmosphere, because atmospheric pressure varies. A pascal is 1 Newton of force exerted on 1 square meter of surface. Torr, though, persists when you take your blood pressure. It's 120/80, that's torr, millimeters of mercury. Now, the ancient Greek philosopher Aristotle, look at that, he lived long before all these famous people in the New Testament, all these dummies who said the things that they said. Aristotle held that a vacuum is impossible. He never said this, that nature abhors a vacuum. Later thinkers expressed it that way. Rabelais, I think, gets the credit. Both Galileo and Descartes accepted this idea as well. So Torricelli's experiment, as you might imagine now, it was a sensation. It created something of a crisis in physics, for if a vacuum is impossible, what was in the top of the tube when the level of mercury fell to 76 centimeters? It seemed that far from a vacuum being impossible, it was quite easy to produce. In the end, though, it turns out that a perfect vacuum is impossible to achieve. Even the best vacuums possible still contain many molecules. The top of Torricelli's mercury-filled tube still had some mercury atoms floating around in it. Even deep space contains stray atoms. Fast forward to the 20th century, and skipping over a wealth of fascinating scientific discovery, we know now that even a theoretical perfect vacuum from which every bit of matter has been removed is still suffused with quantum fields. A bit of space-time with nothing in it, with no thing in it, still has something in it. Space-time itself, in other words, is something. There's the quantum fields showing what quite an active something there is at a quantum level. This is how American physicist Lawrence Krauss can write a book, A Universe from Nothing. And people peddling to claim that God is the answer complain that Krauss is not actually referring to not anything when he says nothing, because he's talking about quantum fields. So here's the more honest answer. Now you know. The reason that there is something instead of nothing is because there's no such thing as nothing. Now, that's not to say that nothing is impossible. Remember, vacuums were said to be impossible. Zero was said to be impossible. Negative numbers were said to be impossible. We're not saying it's impossible. We're just saying that the idea of nothing, there's nothing that to which that can refer to. Kind of like God, there's nothing it can actually refer to in objective reality, only in your imagination. Can you imagine nothing? Maybe. I'm not sure that anyone can really do so, just as it is not really possible to imagine a location, much less anything happening in that location that is outside of space and time. God believers say that God is outside of space and time. Try to imagine that. Every time we try to imagine it, all we get is another space-time. We can imagine a space-time that is separate from our own, but this is still some kind of space-time. And this is the problem with God as an alleged explanation for the conundrum of why there is something instead of nothing. Even if there is an unimaginably powerful extraterrestrial being that creates universes, as good a description of God as any, such a being then becomes an element of something, understood as everything that is. Nor does insisting that such a being is logically necessary, as they assert, add anything to, much less solve the problem of why there is something instead of nothing. It's more than absurd. It's cartoonish. In fact, positing an intelligence beyond the universe creates a bigger problem. This is shown by the famous watchmaker analogy. That is, if we find a watch, we naturally infer a watchmaker because we know that watches come from watchmakers. But we can infer much more than that because, in fact, the watchmaker depends on certain technologies and likely others who developed and applied those technologies to produce all of the components of the watch, such as the tiny gears, the mainspring, the escapement, the balance wheels, dial, and so on. So if or when we ever encounter an extraterrestrial intelligence, we can also infer all the things that necessarily go along with every intelligence that we know of. This includes some physical mechanism for its reception of external information. You have to be able to sense things, perceive things, and then the processing of that information to produce internal mental states and subsequent purposeful behavior, whether that behavior may be scratching an itch, making a move in a game of some kind, or choosing to create a universe. As usual, God as an explanation is of no help whatsoever. Finally, let me refer you to an interesting discussion between the 20th century British philosopher Bertrand Russell, there on the left, and British Roman Catholic priest Frederick Copleston, there on the right. It was a BBC broadcast in 1948, and the topic was the perennial one of the existence of God. Copleston's argument was a well-worn claim that God has to exist as the uncaused cause, or as he put it, something does exist. Therefore, there must be something which accounts for this fact, a being which is outside the series of contingent beings. To this, as you see there, Russell said, I don't admit the connotations of such a term as contingent or the possibility of explanation in Copleston's sense. I think the word contingent inevitably suggests the possibility of something that wouldn't have this, what you might call, accidental character of just being there, and I don't think this is true except in the purely causal sense. You can sometimes give a causal explanation of one thing as being the effect of something else, but that is merely referring one thing to another thing, and there's no, to my mind, explanation in Copleston's sense of anything at all. Nor is there any meaning in calling things contingent because there isn't anything else they could be. At another point, the conversation goes like this. Russell points out the whole concept of cause is one we derive from our observation of particular things. I see no reason whatsoever to suppose that the total has any cause whatsoever. I should say that the universe is just there, and that's all. Of course, this is an interesting thing to say because the God-mongers say that God is just there and that's all. But the problem is, like I said, with respect to nothing, there's nothing to which to refer to in terms of saying that God is there. So even Godists come down to this brute fact of God's existence. So look what Copleston, how he responds. He says, well, I can't see how you can rule out the legitimacy of asking the question how the total or anything at all comes to be there. Why something rather than nothing? That is the question. The fact that we gain our knowledge of causality empirically from particular causes does not rule out the possibility of asking what the cause of the series is. And of course, the whole idea of the causes of things versus why something exists rather than nothing is a different issue. We could do another church service on the whole, does everything need a cause? But Copleston here is saying basically, like a lot of modern, he's not saying quite the same, but the modern apologists, his successors in this God-mongering business often say that an infinite series is impossible. And remember what we mean, what happens to people who say that something is impossible, like a vacuum or zero or negative numbers. Russell followed up with quite an interesting comment. He said, I can illustrate what seems to me your fallacy. Every man who exists has a mother, and it seems to me your argument is that therefore the human race must have a mother. But obviously the human race hasn't a mother. That's a different logical sphere. BBC broadcast is available online on YouTube. It's about 17 minutes long. I found the transcript more useful because it's easier to follow Russell as he makes really quite a lot of excellent points worth thinking about. Copleston's dissemblings are also easier to appreciate if you pay close attention to what he says and how he says it. Subject of the nature of science, what the enterprise of science is predicated on, and what scientists aim to do comes up, and at one point Russell points to quantum physics as finding that some things happen without a cause. Copleston responds by saying, in essence, that Heisenberg must be wrong. So let me leave you with something to keep in mind when beset by those who insist that the only possible answer to something is their unprovable claims. And even in your everyday life, this is really a principle that's well worth remembering. Even when we think we've considered everything possible, we haven't. That is the joy of free thought, that there's always something more to discover, something to look forward to. That is the real meaning of life, at least one of the important ones. And that, if you got the church email, you'll remember that included this meme, Alfred Tarski, famous mathematician, philosopher, and an atheist, who pointed out that we really get confused with semantics. Tarski was one of the two philosophers in the 20th century. The other one was Saul Kripke, who came up with answers to the liar paradox. You may have heard of the saying, you know, someone says, everything I say is a lie. But if that statement is a lie, then it's the truth, and if it's the truth, then it's a lie, and so on. Well, Tarski picked that apart, did a good job of it, I think, and Kripke maybe added something to it as well. Kripke, another brilliant mathematician guy. Well, thank you and good morning. Please do visit our website and look at our YouTube page and our Facebook page. Visit us there. Sign up on our Twitter feed. And remember that this is all part of how you support our Church of Freethought. Our principles, reminding us, we haven't had this up in a while now, but very important. Reason, how we make sense of things. Enjoyment, because it's about pursuing happiness. And finding joy in reason. Appreciating and discovering the good, and love, exploring the meaning and purpose of what we attach value to. Remember, Freethought is not free. You can visit and donate at our churchoffreethought.org website through PayPal. We depend on your continued support, and every bit of it that you give is very much appreciated and needed. Support your values by supporting the NTCOF, because we can do together what none of us can do on our own. We're still running this special discount. You use the discount code ThinkNow, and you only have to tithe 8%. Just kidding. Join us, though, in promoting facts and reason and celebrating doubt. If you have additional ideas for how we can do this better, share them with us, and let's see what we can do. Demonstrate your commitment and be the future that you wish to see. Don't just complain about the godmongers and how dark it is, but light a candle in that darkness and try to do something to make it better. Melius Facet, do better, our Latin motto. Everybody's got to have a Latin motto. Veritas is the motto of my alma mater, but Melius Facet, that's ours. I will proceed to question and answer and discussion, and really am interested in your feedback on some of the things that were brought up here. I know that when some of you heard that we were doing this subject, you right away thought of Lawrence Krauss's book, and of course I mentioned that. If you've read the book, you can share your opinions about that or anything else that you've been thinking about. Thanks again.